this work. I just wanted to say thank you for the invite. If you can't hear me, put your hand up, because I'll stop talking. But I just wanted to say that when I was asked to respond to the theme, the flood of rights, I wanted to try and think about how human rights are related or could possibly map onto a condition of contemporary art. And the way in which I theorised this was looking at this central idea of a principle of freedom that seems pivotal to a history of contemporary arts practice. So, an idea of freedom in art is the idea of an artwork without principles and without rules. And but of course, it means that we also have the principle of freedom that guarantees this idea that art can be anything and should be anything. So I just wanted to look at how this principle of freedom played out in art at its centre, but also how this problem of the principle of freedom mapped onto liberal politics. So thank you, Matthew.
Okay. The paper is called Last Rights, the Non-Tragic Image and the Law. The technological image, that is, images that are produced through mechanical, mass-produced and machinic processes, have acted as the primary site of contention for a politics that places human freedom as its guiding principle. Our anxiety over images is as much historical as contemporary, characterizing modernity from early industrialization and mass production, and prevailing today in worries that a digital culture causes the recession of human morality and the security of identities. Adorno and Horkheimer's social research on the culture industry in the mid-20th century bitterly complained about the invention of the soap opera and mass marketing, as these were understood as forms of pacifying and insidious propaganda. Moreover, in this work, the jitterbug, the automobile, and the bomb occupy equivalent intensities of violence, leveling the spectacular with everyday experience. The techno-image destroys the special qualities of individual people by turning them into identity-free, consuming masses, quote, producing a passive, socialized nature that is dispossessed of community, individuation, and consciousness. Complaints about the totalizing force of digital culture today have not changed so much. Data collection, surveillance within and beyond our consumer choices, and the management of our lives through social media underscore the degree to which our lives are constituted by the mass mediascape of mobile phones, computers, television, cinema, advertising, music, and news. Images are inside our heads, we are them, and they are us. Whilst on the one hand, we can see that progressive technologies enable communication to be quicker, more immediate, and global, on the other hand, the worry is that technological power does not enable the kind of freedom that we had perhaps imagined. It is a homogeneous system that precludes a freedom from this system itself. Herbert Marcuse expresses this sentiment when he writes of a technologically organized totalitarian society that is, quote, a specific system of production and distribution which may well be compatible with a pluralism of parties, newspapers, countervailing powers, etc., end quote. And Adorno and Horkheimer observe, quote, all are free to dance and enjoy themselves just as they have been free since the historical neutralization of religion to join any of the innumerable sects. But freedom to choose an ideology, since ideology always reflects economic coercion, everywhere proves to be freedom to choose what is always the same, end quote. This conformity to reality, as Baudrillard tells us, is diabolical. Films like The Truman Show tell us as much, where a constraint to a constructed reality is made up of a horrific combination of the real, lived, and representational acted experience. In the film, this is a false reality that only love can save us from. For Baudrillard, we are caught up in a mad pursuit of images, in an ever greater fascination which is only accentuated by video and digital images. We've thus come to the paradox that these images describe the equal impossibility of the real and the imaginary. The power of images is enhanced further because they're not authored. There is no power behind the image. Images are a copy without a model, authoring reality for us as given. The techno-image manifests this reality in its mechanisms of distribution, flows and fragmentation from which we cannot move 1 inch away. This all spells crisis. We are constrained to the infinite space of a capitalistic techno-power where our freedoms are accommodated, acted out, and believed in, and the image, that thing we cannot trust, tells us so. This catastrophic diagnosis on the technological image can be paralleled with particular artistic critiques of the image in this and the last century. Specifically, in response to the incapacity for images to index or represent reality, critical arts practices have sought to disclose and reveal the image as a mechanism, system, or apparatus. We've seen a rejection of what we might consider to be creative languages, a moving away from and a distrust of representation, figuration, and symbolism, and a shift towards processes, timelines, performative networks, relations, dynamics, exchanges, and forces. Images and objects proliferate, but they're presented as systems and phenomenological plots. These images express our location within process, within and as part of this system. Crucially, the aim of this critique, which emerges in a range of aesthetic forms and styles, is not to imagine or determine a new way of life, nor to wipe out existing forms of bad power in forms of direct action. Instead, by moving away from representation, there is an attempt to access and know and present the real apparatus of power that constitutes reality as a lived material and technical process. Artworks that have taken this path litter the vista of critically acclaimed practices in this and the last century. These include works that highlight the processional, the performative, the dematerialized object, and the temporal event in the genre of performance art, where a turn to the apparatus or baseline of production is associated as a less mediated, more free, and more real operation of the image. The principle of this critique is not dissimilar to Duchamp's infamous engineering of the urinal work Fountain in 1917, where a critique of the performative operations of the internal workings of the art system became the content of the work. As we know, this involved Duchamp's stage-managed rejection of his alter ego, Richard Mutt's artwork, from the open and supposedly all-inclusive call by the Salon of Independence exhibition, and the subsequent story of this rejection that was presented alongside the now infamous photograph of the urinal by Alfred Stieglitz in the pamphlet The Blind Man. As part of this myth creation, we must not forget the missing and unavailable object of the urinal itself, which adds to this story through highlighting the mystical and negative presence of the ideological apparatus of the art world system. Conceptual art in a general sense manifests this method of critique as central to the production of artworks, where artworks of all kinds were careful to display the epistemological, contradictory, and even paradoxical means of their production. It was this method that became paramount to the work of institutional critique. Whilst institutional critique arrested the apparatus of meaning production, other works invested in the technical apparatus of image production, located specifically in the processes of image machinery and technology. This was given some focus in structuralist-inspired, anti-realist experimental art. Here, the empirical material of the medium, the celluloid, the scratch, the handcrafted mark or accidental stain, all developed through an active process of production, is privileged over and above what the kinds of images the camera would record, capture, and stabilize. In Stan Brackage's work, we're presented with the mechanical process of image material before our eyes, sans camera, and apparently without mediation. Alternatively, ironic and/or parodic artworks, rather than unravel and expose the processes of meaning or production, can be seen to focus instead on our interface with the image of power in a politics of reception. Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes reform and reproduce the homogeneous system of existing power as image in image form in a critique of over-identification where one aligns oneself with the exact principles or images of a power that are understood as dominant and standard. In Warhol's work, the categories of art and life are clashed and collapsed. In this flattening of what is considered true and what is false, we are asked to identify another overriding truth, that of the false nature of both. This unification means that we are caught within a hall of mirrors where both model and copy are equally false, and we know it. Specifically, the role of the artwork is to educate us towards this insight, where this double confrontation of the contested image, or repeat, invites a Nietzschean-inspired eternal return as a form of theatre. In all these cases, the machinery of cultural production is made visible as its own theatre, where artworks locate themselves deep within the system of production, meaning, and exchange. This making visible of specific processes appears as Duchamp's immaterial and perverse reflection of power, Brackage's idealization of processional material that attempts to reject or delete representation altogether, or it is invoked as the dark void of contingency in Warhol's more traditional anti-realist irony, where the world is made false in order to expose a larger truth. These three examples serve to illustrate three primary problems. The first is that we see the production of a hierarchy of images, despite this world of images being understood as borderless flows, communication systems, and infinite networks. Here we begin to see the difference between technical images and representational images, between the processional and the figural, and the conceptual and the experiential image. Ironically, the production of these internal borders is brought about by the desire to deregulate or free language from this space that we are told is already deregulated. Our second problem highlights the contradictions of a theory that seeks to make a distinction between a freedom that is real and a freedom that is false. We see this when artworks set out to claim that other forms of power are in fact false and that they must be exposed as such. However, this method runs into trouble when it has to deal with the language that it puts into effect. How can critique administer and understand its own authoritative claims to power? If all language is designated as unreal and false, then the language it puts to use is equally weak. The consequence of this critique means that not only are other forms of power false, but equally so is the language that makes this claim. All authority must now be put into question, and this results in a tragic critique that targets itself as the object of interrogation. Our third problem is where we can return to the question of freedom. As I've outlined, the methods that we've examined reflects upon the idea that we are constrained to specific systems and processes of power, and that we're located within an apparatus that is deregulated, but somehow, at the same time, totalizing. As such, we can say that the critical position that we have examined explores the consciousness of our constraint. This is a negative relation to freedom, where we are part of the system and we know it. This constraint is key to thinking a freedom to come, but freedom in this case is unpresentable and inaccessible. As such, this consciousness of the false nature of our experiences, written through this desire to engage in systems of image power, does not really give us the tools to do anything about this in a political or practical sense. Rather, it is the key to thinking a freedom to come that is only ever negatively inscribed in relation to the extant constraints of the now, holding no guarantees for freedom, since freedom is only ever abstract. Furthermore, since all power is the target of this critique, we are told that any system in which we would find ourselves would find itself under the same scrutiny. In the end, this stands as our political inertia and a final distraction. A theory that knows this to be the case, and which nevertheless continues to identify failure as some redemptive space, can only be tragic, which is A, that this theory knows it is responsible for defining the now of the status quo, and B, that it cannot move beyond that in real terms. Its parameters are set in the mirror. In Popularity and Realism, Brecht wrote that, quote, "Realistic means discovering the causal complexities of society, unmasking the prevailing view of things as the view of those who are in power, and that we must, quote, keep in step with the rapid developments of reality," end quote. However, in a non-Brechtian world, where any center of power is displaced, there is no longer anything to unmask. The image is all we have. The issue here, as we have seen, is that critique persists in operating with this original Brechtian anti-realist method at its core, and goes to work with the same values of what is designated as real and what is illusory. As a result, and paradoxically, contingent processes that are claimed as unrepresentable are characterized as figures of mystical dominance, and freedom is mystified as an ideal concept. Bearing this diagnosis in mind, we can see that our only hope for a critical image in these cases is for it to express this tragic internal contradiction. The critical image must represent itself as non-redemptive and constrained to its own crisis of representation. Its only redemption, critique, is to recount the failure to be free from representation. As I've hoped to capture, these problems force the question of what we understand to be the value of thinking a freedom for. Because in our description above, freedom is claimed and asserted as a natural right, but one that is impossible to know. What would it mean to think past these moral dimensions of the image that we have seen? How are we to take this de-ontologized and open space of the contingent image seriously without invoking these same hierarchies that seem to lead us to critical, cultural, and political roadblocks, without falling back into the dualisms of the real and the false, without a hierarchy of the real, administrative, and scientific image over that which, without a hierarchy of the real, administrative, and scientific image over that which appears to be mediated, allegorical, and representational. And without a narrative of freedom, tragedy, constraint, and finitude, would we end up in the same space of an epistemological and moral anarchy? Stanley Fish poses this question in his essay Rhetoric, which argues, following Thomas Kuhn, that the force of scientific statements are in the end that of persuasion. Persuasion in this instance does not establish a duality of the false and the true, but rather constitutes a field of language where positions are contested rhetorically. Since there is no neutral foundation for positions, beliefs, arguments, and truth claims to fall back on, we're left with the data that we have to situate our convictions as situated, and these convictions are organizational, persuasive, imaginative, and administrative, representational, and demonstrational. As there is no neutral space to be called upon, we now see an explicit threat to the quasi-scientific approaches to the image evidenced in the artworks that we've seen. This is because any description of a more essentialized and true image system is also interested. Therefore, all language is rhetorical. That is, language seeks to mobilize, to win assent, and to establish itself as true. At the same time, there are no context-independent statements, and language presents us with no guarantees that we can mean what we say. Reading Austin, Fish asserts, quote, "True and false are situation-specific judgments on the relationship between contextually produced utterances and states of affairs that are themselves no less contextually produced." For Fish, end quote, for Fish, the fact that language is unreal, as he says, in this totalizing sense. Sorry, no, he doesn't say that. I'm sorry, it's just highlighted by Amanda in quote marks there. I'll start again. For Fish, the fact that language is unreal in this totalizing sense does not mean that language is incapable of producing facts or of affect. This is because there is no connection between a statement that is contextual and a statement that is false. What Fish is laying down in this process is the assertion of a universal truth, that is, that all statements are rhetorical and contingent. Crucially, there is no regressive circularity that might arise from an ontological relativism, or no irony in this statement, because this claim is also situated and context dependent. It is not correlated to anything. For Fish, an interpretative community is an engine of change. There is no guarantee that we might secure change and no way of recognizing change when it happens because there is no independently verifiable reality to base this measurement upon. This dispossession of distance and the forgetting of historical consciousness does not define a tragic scenario. It is a loss entirely without consequences. Those are Fisher's words, a loss entirely without consequences. It is an unbinding from referents that were never stable in the first place. For Fish, this is not quietism or fatalism, but a description of systems of forces that we interact with, interpret, manifest, and are compelled by because force is the operation of meaning in action. Our rights to freedom have been traditionally understood to be a God-given, where the freedom that we seek is always already there as a pre-political fact, given to us from the ground up at the inception of life, and is set as the standard of a freedom to come. The problem in response to this identification of the pre- and post-political nature of freedom is that it's just that life got in the way, where freedom is always protected as the symbol of what we are not and aspiration for what we might be. But as we have shown, this non-political space is impossible and naive. Our right to free speech, free expression, and free action is not apolitical. The definition of the human as a thing that deserves rights does not come from nowhere. These claims are specific and interested. They're fought for, argued, insisted upon. They're practiced and contested in particular circumstances all the time. As such, any correspondence theory that assumes that we can know freedom as a deontologized real of contingency can only be identified as a mystical post-political alterity, or alternatively as a paranoid form of political constraint. The difficulty of identifying the politics of our right to freedom is therefore instructive. In this case, a critique that holds freedom as its standard bearer, where the empty space of freedom is seen to guarantee just and dissident emancipatory action as a participatory form in a schema of democratic politics, does no more than identify a tragic dimension to the political. For Fish, this right to freedom bears out, quote, no force whatsoever, end quote. Freedom is not illusory, but it is politically weak. Fish's universal claim that everything is contingent lays a destructive force that annihilates the principle of the human as something that is hinged upon freedom, and transfers the human to the legislative, administrative, willful, constraining, and constructive demands that constitute a contingent life. The image, as a concept, is no longer a reflection of false power. Systems of power are no longer absolute, and critique is no longer the task of picturing the human condition, nor of delivering human consciousness in relation to freedom. Discovering, taming, or ordering the practical meaning of abstractions, such as freedom, knowledge, power, or constraint in the name of freedom, does little in producing a politics that might navigate them, because everything is contingent. Here, freedom remains an impossibility, but we don't care. The condition of freedom, its potential, and its finitude is no longer in focus. Ironically, without a principle of freedom, and without the methods of critique that locate themselves within it, we might risk disabling any critical purchase we might have against existing forms of power, including the target of this text, the principle of freedom itself. We risk leaving those forms of power free to rule unfettered from any critique that would target them. It might leave us without a politics altogether. Judged from the perspective of our emancipatory politics, this rejection of freedom might turn out to be a form of passive self-annihilation. The horror is that we are either devoid of imagination, trapped within the legislature of the given, or we are dispossessed of any means by which we can plan, think, and organize our future. Too free and too constrained. However, pitting the principle of a freedom against the prevailing comprehension of freedom is, as I have shown, a false errand, a politics of suicide. It maintains the loop of a project that is only contradictory. Instead, force is the operation of the non-tragic technical image, a space where order and disorder are flattened, and a place where images do not require a referent to freedom or anything else to produce meaning. The non-tragic image has no orientation, but it has a demand. Decision happens. If force operates under no universal identity, name, or principle, we now bear witness to the last rights of freedom as we know it. It is better to take the risk of thinking this non-contradiction than to continue to reproduce life with these same fatal errors. That's it. Welcome to you.